Right, afternoon everybody. My father-in-law once said to me, when you present, you keep yourself awake, but your job is to keep everybody else awake. So I hope it's not too warm and we all fall asleep this afternoon. But as was mentioned, my name is Andrew Hollister. I'm the CISO over at LogRhythm. We specialize in security information and event management. And that's really all about giving you visibility into what's really going on in your environment and helping you to detect and respond to cyber threats more quickly. But as mentioned, I want to talk a little bit more. I don't want to talk about product really. I want to talk a little bit higher level about the current cyber threat landscape and draw out some trends and insights. So let's get right into that. So what's kind of the point in talking? And when I say that I've said the current business environment here, I really mean the environment in which we conduct cybersecurity. And you can ask kind of what's the point in talking about that environment? And I think it's this: everything has a context, really, cybersecurity included. So what's the context for cybersecurity, for the tasks that we're trying to help our customers with? And one of the elements of the current business environment, I suppose one of the key elements, is really the economic headwinds that we're facing. And the head of the World Bank, the chief of the IMF, both said this year they expect to see a third of the world economy in recession. In the UK, we've seen, I think, 14 interest rate rises in a row. And some commentators, I'm not a financial person, so I'm just quoting other people. Some commentators are saying, well, maybe there'll be a recession in the UK ahead of us. And, you know, kind of side by side with that, we're seeing the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. That, according to the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, is the first major war where there's been large-scale cyber operations. The Centre for Strategic and International Studies don't really like this phrase cyber warfare, and they explain all about why that is on their website. But they're thinking about things like distributed denial of service, wipers, malware, phishing, all that kind of stuff. And I think the key piece there really is when you think about that kind of large-scale operations, you can't geofence it. You can't really contain it. And to some extent, we've seen that in kind of kinetic warfare. They sometimes seem to have trouble with being very precise. Equally so in cyber operations, it's difficult to be very precise, and there's lots of collateral damage. Again, a bit related to that, we've seen earlier in the year, tail end of last year, the oil crisis in Europe, prices being pushed up around that, and also really made energy itself a target for cyber criminals. And I think as governments try to grapple with all of the above, we're seeing more and more legislation, more and more governments weighing in on this, and of course with very good reasons for that too. I read an executive order from the Office of the President of the United States which directly cited zero trust. That would have been almost unthinkable 10 years ago. But you know, seeing government take this area seriously is of course encouraging, but of course more regulation doesn't necessarily equal more security. And with, you know, many legislators around the world trying to address the same issues and releasing legislation around the same spaces, the burden of compliance can become significant, not least, of course, for smaller businesses. And, you know, if you think about the last few years or so, it's like one of our partners said to us, it's almost like the world is in a perma-crisis. You know, you've got, we had the pandemic, you've got economic situation, you've got the war in Ukraine, and so on and so on. And of course, the point is all of those things create the environment in which threat actors can continue to ply their trade. So I said earlier, cybersecurity isn't operating in a vacuum, but more or less in a bigger ecosystem. And what happens in this kind of wider business environment is really one of the biggest drivers of digital transformation, of course. And it directly impacts, the business environment directly impacts both the speed and the direction of that transformation. And, you take, for example, academic institutions. Perhaps in some cases, they've been delivering teaching in person for decades, if not centuries. And when the COVID-19 pandemic came along, there was little to no remote teaching before that. Overnight, they had to take the whole thing online in order to continue delivering that service, or just stop entirely. And of course, it was a very similar picture with things like telehealth. So I'm not going to rabbit on about the pandemic all afternoon, but it's a very good example, really, of how a drive for digital transformation, how a change in the business environment drives digital transformation, and in turn drives cybersecurity. And with kind of post the pandemic, we got this kind of perma crisis almost. You got people haven't really gone back to the office in droves. They're working from home. Some of the time they are working from the office. I read an article the other day about some proportion of people working from the beach, which seems to be quite an attractive thing to do. But people are working from all over the place, and kind of, I guess, aside from these key moments of transformation where significant events happen in the world, it's almost like the kind of business of being in business implies financial and regulatory type changes, and they drive in turn other reasons for digital transformation. And I think of our own organisation, it's not a core business for us to run an email service. So why would we do that today? Why not outsource that to people who specialise in doing so? The interesting thing is, in the rush for people to adopt cloud services, it's almost like organisations don't know what they don't know. And the area of cloud security is, of course, quite complex in itself. The shared responsibility model brings its own challenges. And whose responsibility is it actually to know what the default config of the cloud storage I just purchased is? You can say, well, obviously it's your responsibility, you're the buyer, but many organisations have been caught out here. It wasn't what they thought it was. And of course, if we're talking about digital transformation, no conversation would be complete without touching on generative AI. And besides bringing world peace, ChatGPT is going to solve the skills shortage, and we won't need to hire SOC analysts anymore. It's not really the case. But the interesting thing is, we see Microsoft make a $10 billion investment in OpenAI, and also publicly commit to including that technology in their entire product line. So it really is undoubtedly a pivotal moment in technology. Whether generative AI solutions deliver exactly what they promise is going to be another story altogether. But certainly at this moment in time, there's a lot of interest in what can this particular technology actually do for us. But the interesting thing, I think we'll see it more as an assistive technology. I don't really see generative AI replacing humans directly in the SOC, but actually helping them to make sense of all the data that they're trying to consume. And in fact, Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, said at Davos this year, he sees it as augmenting human effort rather than being as a replacement to human effort directly. And he went on to say, we actually need something that changes the productivity curve so that we get real economic growth. And he said, so-called knowledge-based workers shouldn't fear that this new technology is going to steal their jobs. They should embrace it as something that's actually going to assist them. So, kind of in summary, the continual evolution of technology is, of course, inextricably linked with cybersecurity. Digital transformation affects the threat landscape overall. it affects your own attack surface. And this is a theme I want to come back to a little bit later. We're in an infinite game in business, and we want to continue operating as long as possible. And of course, that requires us adapting and changing as the environment around us changes. So I want to just draw a few things out of a number of threat reports. And there's loads of these reports, as I'm sure you know, from many different organisations, both in the vendor space and government and non-profit type organisations. I just want to touch a little bit on these three. The CrowdStrike Global Threat Report is a really interesting report, and amongst other things, they measure what they call the breakout time. That's to say, once a threat actor has landed somewhere in the environment, how long does it take them to move laterally? CrowdStrike found the average breakout time for e-crime was 79 minutes. They found the shortest breakout time they recorded, in any case, was 7 minutes, which I found quite a remarkable figure. In the time it took you to go and make a coffee and come back again, a threat actor had landed and moved laterally within the environment. And that should tell us something about our requirements for response times and our requirements for visibility. Just moving on to the IBM Cost of a Data Breach report. Unsurprisingly, according to the title, it focuses particularly on the costs associated with being breached. The cost's been steadily increases. I'm kind of interested in the trends here. Every year this report gets published, and every year everybody debates what the actual figures are and whether it's the mean or the mode or median and how they came to the figures. But whatever the rights and the wrongs of that is, the cost of a breach, according to this report, has increased by 15% since 2020. The cost of a breach in healthcare in the same period has increased by 53%. And interestingly, IBM go on to say that over 80% of breaches involve data in the cloud, which a little bit back to my earlier point, whose responsibility is it to understand the shared responsibility model? Clearly, people are not understanding it well enough. IBM also went on to say, and this really struck me in connection with CrowdStrike saying the average time is 79 minutes to break out. IBM found the average time to identify a breach was still up at 204 days. So there's a little bit of a gap here. The ENISA report, this is produced by the EU agency that's dedicated to cybersecurity. Again, they've been producing this report for about 10 years. And not surprisingly, they found ransomware being the top threat in the European region, and also that there were very significant attacks against availability during the year, kind of mostly driven by DDoS attacks with the Ukraine conflict being the driver for that. So I've just picked a few kind of interesting pieces from there, but I want to dig a little bit further into another report, which is the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report. Are people familiar with this to some degree or another? This report's been going on for, I think it's now in its 16th year, and it's a little bit unique compared to some of the others about the way it goes about things. And as again indicated by the title, they're really occupied with particularly with breaches. And they reviewed 16,000 odd incidents for this year's report and 5,000 or so breaches. And they define incident and breach very specifically. So an incident is a security event that compromises the integrity, confidentiality, or availability of an information asset, whereas a breach is an incident that results in confirmed disclosure of data. So a DDoS attack, for example, would usually be an incident, but of course that doesn't make it any less serious. So Verizon really focus on this area where a breach in fact took place. But just before I kind of dive into this, it's kind of really interesting to see there's so many reports focusing on successful or unsuccessful incidents and breaches. And Verizon kind of addressed this question right up front. What are we doing this for? And they actually lead their introduction with this. I'm a bit of a sucker for quotes from Churchill, but they lead the introduction with this quote: "Success is stumbling from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm." And the point they make with this is the purpose of looking at all these failures, looking at all these things that shouldn't have happened, of course, isn't to point the finger and kind of wail over how terrible the cybersecurity landscape is, but of course it's to learn something from that happening that we can try and apply to our own environment. And I think that's a very good lens to look through. You know, our industry seems to like writing pages and pages of media print about how terrible it was that such and such an organization got breached. Yeah, maybe it was, but they had a security program. They were presumably trying to do the right things. Security isn't really a binary thing, and I'll come back to that a little bit more in a minute. So anyway, back to the Verizon report. Surprise, ransomware continues to be pervasive. It actually stayed steady as a percentage of breaches compared to last year, at about 24%. And interestingly, the top 3 actions for getting ransomware into an organization were email, desktop sharing software, and web applications. And, you know, I think we're all familiar with phishing and spear phishing and that kind of route into organizations. But I thought the interesting thing here, that desktop sharing software has really become a vector. And when we think about the kind of rush in the pandemic to get people working from home, particularly in the academic sector, which has experienced a lot of ransomware post-pandemic, perhaps some sacrifices were made to security in order to keep those businesses running. And where organizations haven't gone back and kind of shored that up and followed up with it, this has been a vector that threat actors have attacked a great deal. And of course, we know this is kind of ubiquitous among organizations, right from your local school district through to large multinationals. But it's perhaps those more niche areas, and I'm thinking about academia and healthcare, where there's a lot of other stretches on the budgets, and perhaps cybersecurity isn't the first place that they're looking. Just pulling out a few other findings here. Verizon found that 83% of breaches involved external actors. And that, interestingly, that 83% has held steady ever since this report started. The overwhelming majority of threat actors are external, and of that 83%, 95% of those are driven by financial motives, highly skewed to criminal actors. And the kind of remaining 17% includes errors, human error, as well as intentional harm or misuse by the person on the inside. What was also interesting, other stats in the report show that the end user is a more common threat actor than a state actor for most organizations, suggesting perhaps we should pay more attention to day-to-day security management than being so occupied as perhaps some of the industry might be about APTs. And interestingly, I mentioned the IBM cost of a data breach report here. They also found only 6% of attacks were in fact initiated by an internal actor or a malicious internal actor. There's 3 primary ways in which attackers access an organization, and probably not a surprise to anybody in the room: stolen credentials, phishing, and the exploitation of vulnerabilities. And of course, this is a breakdown primarily for external actors, since error and misuse count for the vast majority of internal. And credentials and phishing were also noted as the top 2 vectors by the IBM report. And I think one of the interesting things here is there's a lot of attention paid in our industry to vulnerabilities being exploited, but it's actually a fadingly small vector when you compare it to things like credentials and phishing. And I think this should be something, or this should tell us something really about where we should be focusing our efforts. But for now, let's just remember this figure here, there's a bit of variation in it, but they've placed it around 5%. So whilst vulnerabilities are one of the primary three ways, it does remain in a significant minority.
So those stats for the exploiting a vulnerability is a direct one, as opposed to someone pushing information and inserting something and then getting inside and then exploiting it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They're looking at it as the primary attack vector rather than a secondary one. Yeah. And then I'm not going to go through the whole report, but they do kind of slice and dice this information in lots of different interesting ways. And one of the ways is by region. This is the EMEA region. What I found interesting, the top patterns here were system intrusion, by which they mean complex attacks, things like ransomware, social engineering, which we're familiar with, and then basic web application attacks, which is the kind of get the data, get out type of thing. But every world region showed the same top patterns. The EMEA was 97%, some other regions varied from 90 to 95%, but we're actually seeing almost exactly the same picture wherever you look in the world in terms of how threat actors are getting in, how they move around and so forth. So, as I say, I really recommend the Verizon report. If you haven't read it, it's freely downloadable and it contains lots of useful reference information that you can learn from. But I just want to bring it down perhaps one level. And I just pulled basically a whole load of headlines from both the kind of trade press and the press more generally. And I just picked a period of 2 or 3 months. These aren't all the headlines or anything remotely close to all the headlines. But what are we seeing? We're seeing things like universities being impacted. We're seeing pension funds being impacted famously by the MOVEit breach. I read an article recently about a hospital in the US that closed down, citing, amongst other things, their ransomware attack, as I feel it was like a kind of the final thing that broke the camel's back. We're seeing food producers band together to form their own ISAC. And I think the point I'm trying to get across here is we're not looking here at victimless crimes. You know, universities and schools, you're talking about affecting children's education. Attacking healthcare, we're talking about patient safety. I read about this council that had a ransomware attack. 2 years later, they still can't provide the services that they were providing beforehand to some of the most vulnerable people in our society. So, you know, these aren't, it can be slightly, well, it's cyber. Yeah, it is cyber, but it actually has real world kinetic effects and impacts people's lives. And, you know, I haven't here gone into a lot of the more high profile attacks recently either, thinking notably of Microsoft and Okta and so on and so forth over the course of the last year or so. But I think, again, the point here is all of these organizations had a security program. All of these organizations, especially the big ones, probably invest a lot more than you or I can in cybersecurity, and yet they get breached nonetheless. And the interesting thing is, it's almost like the industry accept it's when, not if, you'll experience a successful cyber attack. But when somebody actually does, there's quite a bit of pointing the finger, and that's something I think we ought to steer away from. Let's learn from it. Let's share that information and raise the level of cybersecurity overall. I just want to pivot a little bit from here and talk about the kind of cybersecurity itself. What is cybersecurity? What do we mean by it? And how should we look at it? And as I've kind of prepared this and other presentations, I ran across a paper done by MIT's Lincoln Lab an overview of zero trust architectures. And I'm not going to pivot and start talking about zero trust now, but I just want to draw a couple of things out of this. They actually presented the paper in a YouTube video you can find, which I really recommend. It's really interesting. But they dug out this paper, catchingly called The Protection of Information in Computer Systems, from 1975, so 48 years ago. And in this paper, the authors found there were three types, or they articulated three types of security violations: an information release, information modification, and denial of use, which roughly equate to the CIA triad that we know today, right? And then they found these eight, or they articulated these eight cybersecurity principles, again, some of which we'd directly recognize: separation of privilege, least privilege, and so on and so forth. And MIT say, well, the roots of zero trust principles actually can be traced back as far as 1975, and we thought it was new. And MIT went on to kind of divide these eight principles into two parts, and one was design and implementation, and the other was operation. And they argue in the paper that operation is where most of the cybersecurity principles actually sit. And if you look at most incidents over the course of the last 10 to 15 years, you'll actually find they fall on the operational side of this table rather than on the implementation side. And again, watch the whole thing to see how that actually looks in practice. But the interesting thing to me, 50 years later, this really tallies with the findings of the Verizon data breach investigation report. There's a lot more incidents attributed to credential theft than there are to vulnerability exploits. But in any case, if operations is where most of cybersecurity is focused, then the kind of industry obsessing about technology solutions and the latest acronyms, which I myself criticize the industry for regularly, that can't possibly be the way forward. And I found this quote. If we've learned anything from the past couple of years, it's that computer security flaws are inevitable. Systems break, vulnerabilities are reported in the press, and still many people put their faith in the next product, the next upgrade, the next patch. This time it's secure. And then the author said, so far it hasn't been. Anybody know who wrote this? Nope, okay. There's Bruce Schneier in April 2000. He could have written this last week, quite frankly. We don't seem to be a lot further on in our understanding than we were back in 2000. And he went on to say, and I guess this is really the core of it, security is a process. It's not a product. You can't buy, much as we might like to, you can't buy a silver bullet. It does not exist. And he went on to say the trick is to reduce your risk of exposure regardless of your products or patches. And he went on to say his primary fear about cyberspace is that people don't understand the risks and they put too much faith in technology's ability to solve them. And products alone can't solve security problems. That holds as true today as it did back in 2000, 23 years ago. Does this mean we shouldn't have products? No, of course not. But a product alone is not going to be the silver bullet for our cybersecurity problems. You need the process and the people to go with it. And as I mentioned, the industry obsession with the kind of next big thing. I was telling my colleagues earlier, I was at InfoSec, I think it was in 2014, and my organization had adopted the big data label at the time. So we had big data all over our stand. And I was just waiting for the doors to open, and my eye fell on the stand a little bit down the way. It was a USB stick manufacturer. And guess what? They had big data on their stand. It's a really big USB stick. It's like it's an obsession with the industry. The latest thing that comes out, we're all going to do this. But, you know, perhaps to take a little bit of a step back and say, well, what does this actually add? What does this actually give us? And thinking about this kind of space of automation and AI particularly, Ali Mellon, she's in fact a principal analyst now over at Forrester, wrote this blog post last autumn, which I really liked, called "The Autonomous SOC is a Pipe Dream." And she talked a bit about this obsession that kind of kicked off then with AI and the autonomous SOC and so on. And she said, the autonomous SOC in my lifetime is about as likely as me piloting the Starship Enterprise in my lifetime, which I think is a pretty good description. And she argues, just like with physical security, humans are still mandatory, even for quite basic processes. And the kind of longer you make the automation chain, the more brittle that automation becomes, and the more it limits the scope of applicability. But of course, this idea, the kind of concept of a set it and forget it security system is really compelling. Everybody wants that, but it's not actually real. At some level, you've got to define rules, and of course, the attackers aren't aware of the rules, and if they were, they wouldn't really care. So, just to finish up Bruce Schneier's article here, he argued that back in 2000, and I think you could probably still say this today, countermeasures were sold as ways to avoid threats. But he said security outside of cyber thinks as countermeasures as the way to avoid risk. And avoiding a threat is black or white, you either did or you didn't. Avoiding risk is, of course, continuous. There's an amount of risk you can accept and some amount that you can't accept. And I just comment that kind of, I guess as people, we like the binary. Yesterday I was vulnerable, today I'm not vulnerable. Yesterday I was insecure, today I'm secure. Unfortunately, the world, at least of cybersecurity, doesn't really work like that, as we know. So, back to the question, what is cybersecurity really? It's not a project. It's not a deterministic state that you reach. It really is a persistent cycle of reducing risk, or you can say it's an exercise of continuous improvement. It's a never-ending process of actually surfacing and addressing risk, and the business environment will change over time. And that in turn will change the digital technology available or in use in your environment, and that has a direct impact on the threat landscape, the attack surface of your organization, and the level of risk. And success then doesn't lie in being 100% secure, but in being passionate, courageous, and perseverant to address those risks one by one within your environment. And of course, you'll always have to address risk unless you shut down the business. I just briefly want to refer to this. I really like this book by Simon Sinek called The Infinite Game. And he talks about in life there are finite and infinite games. And we're more used to finite games. Think of a game of football. It's got a certain number of players, it's got a pitch you play on, it's got a number of rules that you agree upon, and at the end of a certain period of time, somebody's won, somebody's lost, we all trundle off, and maybe there'll be another match later. That's the kind of game we're quite used to. Infinite games are games in which the rules and parameters can change at any time. There are known players, there are unknown players. And actually the objective isn't to win, the objective is to be able to keep playing. And I think that describes the art of cybersecurity quite well and what we're trying to contribute to our own businesses in the efforts that we're making. And perhaps just to show it in a different way, it's really this infinite loop of identifying, analysing, and mitigating and monitoring and then background to identify risk on an ongoing basis. And, you know, I feel like the cybersecurity industry as a whole just needs to be a little bit more transparent about this. There isn't a silver bullet. There isn't a 100% secure state. There is no destination secure. Today I arrived, I don't need to do anything else. And what companies really need is partners who are going to wear their jersey, sit on their side of the table and really help them to be successful in this infinite game. So just, I guess, summarising with our own vision and mission at LogRhythm, we do see this ever-evolving threat landscape overwhelming security teams, And we want to help organizations with high quality signals to reduce the noise that it takes to reduce the time that it takes to detect and respond to cyber threats. That's what I had for today. I hope you found some interesting nuggets in there. If anyone's got any questions, I'll be happy to take them. Otherwise, I'll wish you an enjoyable rest of the day.